The date was March 9, 1974. On a remote island in the Philippines, a Japanese soldier emerged from the jungle, his uniform tattered and faded, his rifle still functional after nearly 3 decades. His name was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, and for him, World War II had never ended. While the world had moved on, rebuilt nations, and lived through almost 30 years of peace, Onoda had continued fighting a war that had been over since 1945. This is not just the story of one man's incredible survival, but a window into the psychology of duty, honor, and the devastating consequences when soldiers are trained too well to never surrender. Hiroo Onoda was not alone in his decades-long war. He was simply the most famous of several Japanese soldiers who refused to believe that their empire had surrendered. Onoda's story began in 1944 when he was selected for specialized training in guerrilla warfare and intelligence operations. He was sent to Nakano School, an institution that trained Japanese officers in unconventional warfare, espionage, and survival tactics. The training was brutal and the indoctrination was absolute. Students were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death was preferable to capture, and that their duty to the emperor transcended everything. In December 1944, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with explicit orders from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The orders were clear. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily. When American forces liberated the Philippines in 1945, most Japanese soldiers either surrendered or died in combat. But Onoda and 3 other soldiers retreated into the mountains of Lubang Island. They believed the American victory was temporary and that Japanese forces would return. They had been trained to recognize enemy propaganda, which meant they were prepared to disbelieve any information suggesting Japan had lost the war. In the months following Japan's surrender, Allied forces dropped thousands of leaflets over Lubang Island announcing the war's end. The leaflets included specific details about the surrender and orders from Japanese commanders telling soldiers to lay down their arms. Onoda and his companions examined these leaflets carefully and concluded they were American propaganda. The quality of the printing seemed too good, the language too perfect. Surely these were forgeries designed to trick them into surrendering. The 4 men established a routine of survival and continued military operations. They raided local farms for food, engaged in occasional skirmishes with Filipino police, and maintained their weapons and equipment. They moved constantly through the jungle, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. Their training had prepared them perfectly for this existence. The psychological dimension of their situation was complex. These men had been conditioned to believe that individual life meant nothing compared to duty and honor. Every piece of evidence that the war had ended was filtered through suspicion. Newspapers left in the jungle, obviously propaganda. Photographs of peaceful Japan, clearly fabricated. Even letters from family members were dismissed as forgeries or coerced messages. In 1950, after 6 years in the jungle, Private Akatsu separated from the group and surrendered to Filipino forces. The remaining 3 men saw this as desertion and became even more determined to continue their mission. Years passed and the world transformed around them. Japan rebuilt and became an economic powerhouse. The Cold War reshaped global politics. Technology advanced at an incredible pace. But in the jungles of Lubang, 3 men lived as if frozen in 1944. In 1954, Corporal Shimada was killed in a firefight with a Filipino search party. Now only Onoda and Kozuka remained. The death of their comrade reinforced their belief that they were still at war. Why else would Filipinos be shooting at them? They mourned Shimada and continued their mission, 2 soldiers maintaining a war effort for an empire that no longer existed. The Philippine government and Japanese authorities made numerous attempts to contact the remaining soldiers. They sent search parties with loudspeakers broadcasting messages in Japanese. Family members traveled to Lubang and called out to their sons and brothers. Japanese officials came with proof that the war had ended. Nothing worked. Onoda and Kozuka were experts at evading detection and remained convinced these efforts were elaborate enemy tricks. In 1972, nearly 3 decades after the war ended, Kozuka was killed in a confrontation with Philippine police during a raid on a rice storage facility. For the first time in 28 years, Hiroo Onoda was alone. He was now 50 years old, had spent more than half his life in the jungle, and was the last Japanese soldier still fighting World War II. Onoda's solitary existence might have continued indefinitely, But fate intervened in the form of a young Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki. Suzuki was an adventurer who wanted to find three things: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Onoda. In February 1974, Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island and ventured into the jungle. Against all odds, Suzuki found Onoda. Their initial encounter was tense, with Onoda pointing his rifle at the stranger. But Suzuki was unarmed and spoke respectfully, explaining he had come from Japan specifically to find him. They talked for hours over several meetings. Suzuki showed Onoda photographs of modern Japan, but Onoda remained skeptical. Finally, Onoda told Suzuki his terms. He would only surrender if he received direct orders from his commanding officer, Major Taniguchi. Suzuki returned to Japan with this information, and the government located Taniguchi, now a retired bookseller. Taniguchi agreed to travel to the Philippines. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi met with Lieutenant Onoda in the jungles of Lubang Island. It was an emotional reunion between two men separated by 3 decades. Taniguchi formally relieved Onoda of his duties. He read official orders stating that all combat operations had ceased in 1945, and that Onoda was to lay down his arms and return to Japan. Only then, after hearing these words from his superior officer, did Hiroo Onoda accept that the war was truly over. He formally surrendered his sword, his rifle which was still in working condition, ammunition, hand grenades, and his dagger. He stood at attention one final time as a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army. After 29 years, his war had finally ended. Onoda's return to Japan was sensational. He became an instant celebrity, though the reception was mixed. Many saw him as a symbol of loyalty and dedication. Others viewed him as a tragic figure whose life had been stolen by outdated ideas of honor. The world he returned to was unrecognizable. Japan was now a democracy and an ally of the United States. The psychological adjustment was immense. Onoda had to learn about modern technology and understand that Japan was now peaceful and prosperous. For a man who had spent 30 years living by a strict military code, modern Japan was alien territory. He eventually moved to Brazil, where he started a cattle ranch and survival training school, finding it easier to live where people didn't know his story. But Onoda was not unique. On Guam, Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi hid in the jungle for 28 years before being discovered in 1972. In Indonesia, another soldier remained in hiding for decades. These men shared similar training and orders. They had been conditioned so thoroughly to never surrender that they literally couldn't accept the war's end without proper military channels confirming it. The story of these holdout soldiers raises profound questions about military training, loyalty, and the ethics of war. These men had been turned into perfect soldiers, so dedicated to their mission that they sacrificed decades of their lives. Their loyalty was absolute, their determination unbreakable. But at what cost? They lost the best years of their lives and caused fear and occasional violence in the communities where they operated. President Ferdinand Marcos granted Onoda a full pardon, recognizing that his actions, while causing harm, came from a genuine if mistaken belief that he was serving his country. Onoda lived until 2014, reaching the age of 91. In his later years, he reflected on his experience with mixed feelings. He never regretted his loyalty, but he acknowledged the price he had paid. The legacy of Hiroo Onoda and the other holdout soldiers serves as a cautionary tale about the power of indoctrination and the danger of creating soldiers who cannot adapt to changing circumstances. It demonstrates how training can be so effective that it becomes a prison, trapping people in mindsets that no longer serve any purpose. When Onoda finally emerged from the jungle in 1974, he wasn't just a soldier from another time. He was a ghost from a war the world had tried to forget, a living reminder of the human cost of conflict that extends far beyond the battlefield. His story challenges us to consider what we ask of soldiers, how we train them, and what responsibility we have to help them transition back to peace. The soldier who fought for 29 years after the war ended proved that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the mind's ability to accept that the fighting is over. Hiroo Onoda's war finally ended in 1974, but the questions his story raises about duty, honor, and the psychology of warfare continue to resonate decades later.